already told you that the inflation rate that we're currently experiencing is nearly double what you're being told, and the people responsible do not want you to know why. Now, the latest CPI report for June 2022 showed that inflation rose 9.1% over the last 12 months, which was significantly higher than what was to be expected. But the thing is, inflation is almost certainly much higher than even that. But before we explain how, let me show you how the feds calculate inflation. The Bureau of Labor Statistics tracks the price of what they call a basket of goods and services, and this is intended to represent the average consumer patterns of an American. This creates what's called the Consumer Price Index, or CPI, and that's the figure we see in the news headlines whenever inflation is cited. But here's the problem. Originally, the CPI was meant to track the cost associated with keeping a person's current standard of living. And this was done by using a simple basket of goods approach to see how much you and your family were spending on things like groceries, housing, transportation, or even a family vacation. But starting in the 1980s, the Fed began to change the way it calculated inflation. And they did it by no longer measuring a constant basket of goods, but rather using what's known as substitution. And that is where things started to get sketchy. Because the whole point of identifying the effects of inflation is built around comparing the price of the same goods and services over time. But the feds allow for cheaper substitutes and alternatives in their calculation, then they're actually hiding the effects of inflation. And this has led to widespread allegations that the CPI numbers have been rigged for the last 40 years. Because as prices rise over time for certain goods faster than others, the federal government just assumes that people naturally switch to buying cheaper, poorer quality goods of the same type. What's more, the federal government updated the CPI calculations again in the 1990s, only to exacerbate this problem further. The result? Well, if we're using the same calculation standards of the 1980s, then the current inflation rate in the United States today is actually at a whopping 18%. And that's even higher than it was during the worst months of the inflation crisis of the late 1970s and early 1980s. But this begs the question, why did they change the metrics in the first place? Now, it would be easy to conclude that the reason is they want to hide their own culpability in the economic catastrophe that's being created. But the true reason might actually be a lot worse. The federal government changed the metrics because it makes it easier for them to protect their favorite mechanism for manipulating the economy. But now that almost everyone across the United States, and indeed around the world, knows that we are in an inflationary crisis like never before, the question is, just how bad can it really get? Well, imagine picking up a loaf of bread off the shelf at your grocery store and the price of it changing before you even make it to the checkout line. Don't believe it's possible? Check out this video on Zimbabwe right here.